question, Ali, is why has the mood soured since the framework deal was announced? We had that initial sort of euphoria from some quarters. Why are we now looking very pessimistically at it, and there's all this talk of, well, the deal is not very fair, Iran has to give in more tangible concessions in return for things which are less certain?
Sami, as your only guest who was in Lausanne last week, let me first reassure you that the parties have agreed to much more than they have divulged publicly. The reality is that it would have been political suicide for Foreign Minister Zarif and President Rouhani to accept a deal and make a public announcement about it, in which their primary concern...
I have to ask you then, Ali, do share with us what else did they agree to that you might be aware of? Fill us in.
Well, exactly. The issue of sanctions relief has been discussed in details, and a mutually acceptable formula has been found. Now, the exact schedule and implementation of that deal still needs to be discussed, but the formula, I think, is already there. And although the parties have different narratives about how that is going to happen, I don't see a fundamental contradiction. The reason that we're having this discussion now is that I think both parties were reluctant to come out with a half-hearted statement because they knew it would not satisfy everyone. The problem was that U.S. Congress required some specifics and required to make sure that progress is being made in these negotiations. So the solution that the parties found was that they would come out with an official statement that is very general, but then each would be able to put out their own narratives. True, their narratives sometimes are contradictory, but that's part of the selling process of this agreement.
All right, but is this contradictory narrative, Ali, is this a contradiction because details haven't been agreed on the schedule for lifting sanctions, or because some parties are changing their mind?
As I mentioned, details have been agreed to. When it gets to sanctions relief, there have been a lot of discussions about lifting the U.S. sanctions, the UN sanctions, and the EU sanctions.
Okay, if that's the case, then, Ali, who's backtracking then? If these details on the schedule have been agreed, who's backing out?
No one is backtracking. They have different narratives, and the reason is, at this stage, because the deal is still not final. We don't have a deal in the real sense of the word. We have an understanding. They don't want to put out all of these details because it would just make it much more difficult for them to sustain this process until the deadline, the real deadline of June 30th. So, as I said, part of it is inevitable, but I think we have to blame the U.S. Congress for it, because they were the ones who made the March 30th deadline a serious deadline, whereas in reality it was a soft deadline.
All right, talking about then how the different